Hi everybody, this is Matthew's Movie Mentions for week 35, so everything up to the 3rd of September. And I'd secretly wanted to try to do a week where I watched at least 14 films. I've come close on a couple of occasions this year, but I thought it was always just going to be a bit too much. This week, however, I managed it. I watched 14 films, 12 of them were new, 4 of them from the BFI channel on Amazon that I signed up for last week. So classics that I'd always wanted to watch. A pretty good week. In fact, it would have been 15. I started watching Selma on the train home from a work trip last week, and I got to within about half an hour of the end, so I thought, right, I'll watch it when I get home. Got home, opened up my iPad, started playing, and it said it couldn't play it because it's now no longer on Netflix since I downloaded it to my iPad, and it now wouldn't play the version on my iPad. So I've got to wait for it to rock up somewhere again to watch that last half hour. But this week what I did watch and what we're talking about are Metropolis, The Passion of Joan of Arc, Don't Breathe, Punch Drunk Love, Star Trek III The Search for Spock, Wayne's World, M, Pitch Perfect 3, Justice League Dark, Paris, Texas, Do You Want to Win, Horus the Prince of the Sun, The Little Hours, and Passport to Pimlico. There are lots of P's in those titles. We're going to have lots of plosives this episode. I apologise right now. Metropolis is one of the most famous films, especially in the sci-fi genre. I'd seen lots of bits of it. I hadn't seen all of it in one sort of continuous thing. It is every bit as good as you might imagine. The performances maybe lack an element of nuance, but it is a silent film very early in cinema's history, so you can probably forgive it. The story itself is super interesting. The concepts and the ideas that present on screen, they'd still be interesting and good now in a film. And all told, it is an impressive feat, this grand spectacle of a film that does so many interesting things. The Passion of Joan of Arc, if we say that the Metropolis can be forgiven for the performances lacking nuance, then The Passion of Joan of Arc is the reason why perhaps we shouldn't forgive it, because there are some wonderful performances here. The internal stuff, particularly from the protagonist, it's just terrific what you see her go through. Some of the sort of over-the-top villainy from the court is interesting and works very well. That it's taken from actual court documents is superb, and I think you could put this up with something like 12 Angry Men that sort of tells that unravelling tale as you go through the process and see interesting things occur, see people changing their mind and actually having their thoughts and ideas challenged. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I was really pleased I finally watched it. Don't Breathe, the premise sounded interesting, a sort of home invasion where the main guy was completely blind, so they just had to stay silent around him. It was recommended to me recently, so I watched it, and it does go a fair amount beyond what I expected. And as you get into the second half of the film, it gets fairly disturbing and quite dark. It does some really fairly horrific, horrifying things. I watched it on the train, which is not the ideal scenario for a film like this that's dark and tense. I can still see how it is pretty effective at what it does, though. It uncomfortable yet engaging, I think that's how I would describe it. Punch Drunk Love, Mark Commode talked about this on his recent series about cinema genres. I'd often heard that it was a romantic comedy worth watching. I'm not sure still on it. I'm not totally sold. It is different from the norm, and the filmmakers had put a lot of time and effort into the stylistic presentation of the film, but I feel like I didn't really care for anyone in the film, or I didn't feel sympathetic towards them, so perhaps they should have put more time into addressing that and filling out the characters a bit more than some of the colour and the sounds and the themes. The imagery is startling. It's a really good-looking film, but I didn't really gravitate towards any of the characters. Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, is one of my favourite Star Trek films. We're covering this on Pop Culture Deprived coming up, so it's going to be a good conversation about why this film is lumped with the other odd-numbered films in the series. It is much better than the rest in that sequence. There's some great performances in it. There's still that sort of chuckle, wry grin element to it, but there are some emotional moments in this film that I think are pretty well delivered. Wayne's World is another film we're doing on Pop Culture Deprived. I think the film hasn't aged as well as some others, particularly a film like Bill and Ted. Some of the comedy is absolutely top drawer. It does a lot with a very little. M is another BFI channel film that I'd wanted to see for a very long time. It's a superbly made thriller. The use of the leitmotif, the recurring sound to identify the killer, and the fact that he's not revealed for so long, it all adds to this really pervasive feeling of tension and disquiet all the way through. The way the film covers so many different stories and viewpoints, the businesses, the police, the criminals, the children, it really does set it apart from other films of this type. Pitch Perfect 3, I was not expecting great things from. I got less than I expected. I feel like they made the wrong film here. It goes back into they're in a competition that they want to win and they antagonize and show off against the other bands, rather than it being a swan song, one last ride for these girls, and actually making friends on the journey, realizing there's another world out there and they can continue singing as a hobby, as something they enjoy, but they should start developing the other things they do, and this should be something they enjoy rather than it being a chore and a competition. I think that film would have been supported well by the subplot with John Lithgow and I can't remember the girl's name, Amy, Patricia, what's her? Rebel Wilson, that's her name. The story there, but even that ends up not working for the story we get. They almost clash with each other, and it sort of forgets what story it's telling at times. It ends up just as a weak film with bad accents, some offensive jokes that just annoy me, and altogether it's pretty lackluster. Justice League Dark, we are talking about this on Across the Arrowverse because it's still in hiatus, and so we're watching other DC material. This has got Matt Ryan, who is Constantine in the TV series, as Constantine here, and casting him as inspired. He's a wonderful Constantine. The film doesn't do much to explain the backgrounds of some of the characters. You're expected to know a lot about the key players, which may or may not work depending on your viewpoint, but the story's excellent. It's a much more grown-up film than normally we get from DC Animated. It's incredibly dark at times, but I enjoyed it for the hour and a quarter that it lasts. Paris, Texas is another classic film that I've always been recommended to see. I think I can respect the filmmaking talent that's on display here as much as I didn't enjoy watching the film. It is beautiful. There are some shots in here that the sequence is held so long, the single shot itself might be held for an incredibly long time. The actors have to get through a lot of work whilst they're doing it, but it allows them to do some interesting, difficult things on screen. The story unfolds really slowly, and the relationships are very well done in the way they come out, but for me, it was just paced a bit too slowly to really enjoy it. Do you want to win? I do like a good football documentary. The Zidane 21st century portrait is a wonderful football documentary. This was billed as Leeds United and Manchester United fight it out to win the last Division 1 trophy before it becomes a Premiership, but that's not what this film is about. This is a lot of talking heads talking about Leeds United going from basically the bottom of Division 2 to winning Division 1 in a couple of seasons. It could have been interesting, but there's not really that much football on display here. It's mostly people talking. And because it's focused almost entirely on Leeds, it's probably only interesting to fans of Leeds United. Horus, Prince of the Sun was billed as one of the earliest Studio Ghibli films, which it isn't. It's from the creator of Studio Ghibli. But it is a really good story. It gets a little bit weird as it goes on, and a little unclear who's actually doing what. And there's some strange stuff with the animation when it does static images panned across the screen for the fight sequences, but it's worth watching from a historical perspective. There are better stories that do the same sort of thing, though. The Little Hours, I like Alison Brie and I like Aubrey Plaza, but I like what they do on TV. Mad Men, Community, Parks and Rec, Legion, but I've not seen a film with either of them in that I really enjoyed. This was kind of the last time I was going to try watching them and seeing, okay, can they do enough to actually make me want to see them in films? And it isn't good enough to make me want to see any more. The joke here is people from a medieval time, in the Middle Ages, swearing and talking in a modern fashion and doing some slightly modern things. It's funny for the first 10 minutes, but the joke never goes beyond that, so it ends up pretty forgettable. And Passport to Pimlico is a 1949 film that I'd been intrigued to see after I read the history of Wayne's World 2 and found out Wayne's World 2 was originally partially inspired by this. I thoroughly enjoyed this. It has a lot of very English humour that I think might get lost on a lot of people not from the UK. I think there's a lot of the humour that was lost on me just because it's so in its time. There's probably a lot that I just did not understand as references to austerity at the time, to rationing, to the way they sort of controlled the streets in post-war Britain. But it's a good story. There's some funny characters. There is a final gag in this film that makes it all worthwhile for me. My recommendation this week is M. It's just come onto Amazon Prime, and I urge everyone to watch this. It's a really intense film, and in some ways you can see it almost inventing the modern horror, modern thriller. But it delivers a much more expansive film than I expected from it. So it's now come on Amazon Prime. I would say go and seek out M. That is well worth the watch. So next week, we're now into September, so we're into the last quarter, but I am well ahead of myself. I'm doing pretty good, so I'm going to keep on trucking, and I will see you week 36.